Hey everybody, this is Tracy here with another edition of A View from Tracy's Point, and this is the third part of the arrest that took place today. You can go back and check my previous videos where I talk about the fact that 3 men were arrested today, and the Eastern District of New York is trying to connect these cases to the R. Kelly case, trying to build I guess support for their notion that he was running an enterprise. And although none of the actual indictments say that Mr. Kelly is involved with any of these, they are saying that these actions taken by these 3 men were connected to the case. They fall short of saying that he ordered them to do the things that they did. And so the first video I talked about, the charges, just an overview of what took place. The second video was the indictment against Don Russell. And I said in that video that Don had been released, or he wasn't in custody. I'm not sure if that's correct, but I do believe that he is not in custody at the time. And then one of the other guys, the other 2 guys, the one I'm going to read now is Richard Arline, and the other one was Michael Williams. Both of them had their arraignments. One was yesterday and one was today. But the article that I read didn't say whether or not they were remanded to custody or if they were just brought in, read the charges, and then the judge told them whatever it was that he told them. But I'm sure more information will be coming out. But let's go ahead and get started in reading the indictment against Richard Arlen. Oh, and then the other thing that I wanted to point out that I didn't mention in the other videos is that I think it is extremely interesting that of all the cases in Cook County and in the Northern District of Illinois, why is it only the Eastern District of New York that seems to be having all these issues where their witnesses are being intimidated and all this other stuff? But we all know that it is because they are trying to build support for when R. Kelly goes before his appeal goes before the Second Circuit Appellate Court on September 4th, and they want to have documentation showing that they, are right in not wanting him to get bond so that he can get out and work with his attorneys on his case. And so we'll see how all of that works out. So let's go ahead. This is the Eastern District of New York versus Richard Arline Jr. And it starts out talking about the Sylvette Reynoso, who works with Homeland Security, who interestingly was the one that investigated all 3 of these cases. Imagine that. And so it goes on to say, on or about and between January 9th, 2020 and June 2020, both dates being approximate and inclusive within the Eastern District of New York and elsewhere, the defendant, Richard Arlen, together with others, did knowingly and intentionally attempt to corruptly persuade another person, to wit, Jane Doe, an individual whose identity is known to the affiant, and engage in misleading conduct towards Jane Doe with intent to influence, delay, and prevent the testimony of Jane Doe in an official proceeding, the United States versus Robert Sylvester Kelly. On or about between January 9th, 2020 and June 2020, both dates being approximate and inclusive within the Eastern District of New York and elsewhere, the defendant, Richard Arlen Jr., together with others, did knowingly, intentionally, and corruptly offer a thing of value to Jane Doe, an individual whose identity is known to the affiant, with intent to influence the testimony under oath and affirmation of Jane Doe as a witness upon a trial, hearing, and other proceeding before a court authorized by the laws of the United States to hear evidence and take testimony. in the Eastern District of New York, and with intent to influence Jane Doe to absent herself therefrom. And then they give the United States Code, Title 18, 201B32 and 3551. The source of your deponent's information and the grounds for her belief are as follows. And then it gives the information that I've already read in the previous videos, where the special agent talks about who she is, who she works for, what things she is specialized to cover, blase. And then they talk about the case against Robert Sylvester Kelly. And then it picks up on number 3 on June 20th, 2019. A grand jury indicted him on racketeering. And then they talk about the superseding indictments that have been filed in the case. And then number 4, it says a review of telephone records for a cellular telephone number used by the defendant, Arlen Johnson, with a 708 area code and ending in 7687. Hereinafter, the Arlen 7687 telephone shows that Arlen Jr. communicated with 2 telephones used by Kelly prior to Kelly's federal arrest and incarceration in July 2019. The records also show that the defendant, Arlen Jr., was in telephone contact with telephones believed to be used by the individuals identified herein as I-1, I-3, I-4, and I-5, whose identities are known to the affiant. Telephone records also show that I-3 was in contact with telephones used by Kelly prior to his federal arrest and incarceration in July 2019. The records also show that Arlen Jr. was in telephone contact with other telephone numbers that also were in telephone contact with Kelly prior to his federal arrest and incarceration in July 2019. The available records do not show any telephone contact between Arlen Jr. and the telephones known or believed to be used by the individual identified herein as I-2, whose identity is known to the affiant, but the available records do not reflect iMessages or FaceTime telephone calls. Number 5, on January 8, 2020, Jane Doe began cooperating with federal law enforcement. Several news outlets reported that Jane Doe was cooperating with federal law enforcement, and so we know that that is Azriel Clary. In the notes section, it says information provided by Jane Doe has been corroborated by other evidence, including information obtained from other witnesses, evidence seized from electronic devices, documentary evidence, telephone records, text messages, and consensual recordings. Jane Doe has engaged the services of a lawyer and may seek civil remedies against Kelly in the future. Go figure, everybody else done sued him, why shouldn't she? Prior to her cooperation with federal law enforcement, while still engaged in this might pick up somewhere down here because they just cut off, in a relationship with Kelly, in a March 2019 television interview following Kelly's arrest on various sexual misconduct charges involving her brought by the Cook County State's Attorney Office, Jane Doe publicly claimed that she did not sleep with Kelly when she was a certain age. Jane Doe has advised that such statements were false and made publicly at Kelly's direction. Yeah, whatever, Azriel. Okay, let me go back up to the top here. So number 6, on January 9, 2020 at 3:16 a.m., an individual using the Instagram account rich_dollars_ with vanity name Hood Rich, hereinafter the Hood Rich Instagram account, sent Jane Doe a private message to her Instagram account that read, "You okay, baby?" Jane Doe did not recognize Hood Rich and did not respond. Based on a review of publicity accessible content on the Hood Rich Instagram account, including the apparent selfie images posted on the account resemble a photograph of Arlen Jr., there is probable cause to believe that this account belongs to the defendant, Richard Arline Jr. 7. On or about May 26, 2020, I1, who had been in communication with Jane Doe, exchanged the following series of text messages via iMessage with Jane Doe. I1, I have something to tell you. I1, Rob is trying to get his cousin Rich in contact with you because he wants to pay you for silence. Rich called me and I said, first name of Jane Doe is done, and I said Azriel is done with Rob and she don't want S from him and won't sign her name away to the devil. Yeah, right, Azriel. Number 8, following her receipt of the above text messages, Jane Doe advised a federal enforcement agent involved in the investigation of her receipt of the text messages. At the direction of federal law enforcement, Jane Doe thereafter continued to communicate with I1 regarding the subject matter of Cousin Rich and payment by Rob via text message using iMessage. Jane Doe, I'm just curious as to how much Rob is trying to give me. Jane Doe, when can he call you? Because he texted me in January after everything in Chicago. I1, hiya, I just called Rich and he wants to do a 3-way call with us. 3, can you do that right now? Jane Doe, dang, I actually have a full schedule today. Like doing what, girl? But we can do it later. I already woke up mad late. I1, Rich talked to Rob on the regular, and the only reason why I know Rich is telling the truth because Rob told him to get in touch with Bear, and Rich asked me who was Bear, and I said you, girl. These people are so stupid. Based on my participation in this investigation, there is probable cause to believe that the Rob in the above text messages is a reference to Kelly. 9. On the evening of May 26, 2020, at the direction of law enforcement, Jane Doe called I1 and I1 thereafter called the individual. Jane Doe called I1 and I1 thereafter called the individual I1 referred to as Kelly's cousin, Rich, who there is probable cause to believe is the defendant, Richard Arline Jr., and conferenced the telephone call so that Jane Doe, I1, and Arlen Jr. were in a 3-way telephone call. Okay, so are we saying that I1 is Kelly? Okay. Anyway, a review of telephone records for the Arlen 7687 telephone and the telephone used by I9 shows that the Arlen 7687 telephone was used for the 3-way call with I1, Jane Doe, and Arlen Jr. A few hours later, at the direction of law enforcement, Jane Doe participated in a telephone call with Arlen Jr. over the Arlen 7687 telephone a second time. The telephone calls were recorded by law enforcement with the consent of Jane Doe. 10. A law enforcement agent listened to the 2 calls described in the above paragraph during their transmission, and law enforcement agents have also received the recordings of the calls. In the calls, Arlen Jr. and Jane Doe repeatedly referenced the first name of I2. Jane Doe has advised that I2 was a close associate of Kelly who had access to Kelly's funds since Kelly was incarcerated in July 2019 at a federal detention facility. Law enforcement agents have further reviewed telephone calls placed by Kelly or at the direction of Kelly, which calls are recorded pursuant to the Federal Bureau of Prisons policy to record all non-legal calls placed by inmates, and have determined that Kelly regularly directs I2 or others to direct I2 to make certain distributions of money. Child. So is I2, I guess I2 is the person, is that Keith or whoever the longtime friend is that's getting the royalties that was implicated in the Some Brothers Love child bank records. Okay. These people, now listen, I'm an author. And I know fiction when I see fiction. That's all I'm gonna say. So let's move on to number 11. In substance, during the recorded three-way telephone call described in paragraph 9 above, Arlen Jr. discussed a proposal in which Jane Doe would receive $500,000 in exchange for not continuing to cooperate with the government against Kelly. Following is a transcript of that portion of the three-way call described in paragraph 9. Arlen Jr., they threw out a number, Azriel. So what's the number that they threw out? Arlen Jr. I talked to first name of I2, whoever is controlling the money. I talked to, and then says it again, or they just typed it twice because they were so excited about their writing. And he was kind of like, hey man, what do you think you can do? Because I threw out a number. I'm like, I'm thinking 100,000. He was like, man, she ain't gonna go for that because y'all know she a gold digger. No, they ain't say that about the gold digger part, but hey, since we working on this work of fiction, we're gonna roll with it, okay? So then Az replied, never. And then Arlen Jr., I'm like, what you thinking? He was like, $500,000? And then Az was like, I wouldn't go for $500,000 either. I want all the money. I want to be wifey. Ain't you heard my song? He chose somebody else, so it's home, Buster. Okay. And then Arlen said, oh yeah, what you trying to do, girl? So then Az then told Arlen Jr. over the Arlen 7687 telephone that she would need $1 million and wanted Arlen Jr. to send her a small sum of money within the next 24 hours as a sign of good faith. And then number 12, during one of the consensually recorded telephone calls described in paragraph 9, Arlen Jr. explained how he had communicated with Kelly, who was incarcerated. So Az was like, I just want to know, how are you talking to Rob? Because at least when we were talking to him, he was saying that his calls were limited and stuff like that. So I'm just trying to figure out, and then Arlen Jr. cut off and was like, yeah, he talk. He normally talks to, and then says this unnamed person again, who control the money. And then Az was like, yeah, first name, yeah, okay. Then Arlen was like, yeah, so normally he talks to him. He has him call me on a three-way call. I don't know what number he has for him, but he normally calls me on three-way calls before he went to jail. He wanted me to get in contact with him, so I got in contact, and me and her go to school together. So, and then Az was like, right. Yeah, I remember him telling me that. That's the only time I remember him ever mentioning you. What he told me, that something different that, was getting in touch with you. So then Arlen said, okay, I don't know what the hell he be having going on. The stories are lies or what the hell he got going on. I just know he got some issues. I love him, but he got to fix the issues. And when I talked to him about you personally, girl, he said, can you see if you can get in contact with Bear and fix it for me? Man. So I reached out, on Instagram first. And then Az replied, so when he called you to fix it, did he email you? Because around January when you reached out to me, we were just emailing each other. So how did he reach out to you? He called you from MCC, boy? And then Arlen replied, trying to exactly remember how the hell did it work out, because I remember that it was a little bit after his birthday or something. I had talked to him. And then Az was like, yeah, right, nigga. No, she didn't really say that, y'all. So y'all know I'm improvising on this conversation, right? So then Arlen replied, yeah, so that was around that time. Then we ended up talking again, and he was like, can you see what's going on with Bear? And can you keep this between you and her? But he always never really wanted to mention the names over the phone. And then Az was like, right. And then Arlen replied, so I really didn't know who the hell, I really didn't know who Bear was, because, you know, she told me. And then based on my, then this is back to the Homeland Security person. Based on my participation in the investigation, there is probable cause to believe that in this telephone call, Arlen Jr. explained that Kelly and I too maintained contact with each other while Kelly was in jail, that on or around Kelly's birthday, January 8, 2020, he called Arlen Jr. while he and Kelly were speaking, and they discussed Az, who goes by Bear, which is the nickname used by Kelly for her. 13. As set forth below, during one of the telephone calls described in paragraph 9, Arlen Jr. also made clear to Az why Kelly would pay her for silence, which he stated he learned from I2 and another individual whose identity is known to the government as I3. So Arlen Jr. says, so what, like I'm saying, I don't want nothing. I tell you to go past me and you cause, because I see you do your YouTube, girl. And then Jane Doe Az was like, it's the boy, please. And then Arlen Jr. is like, I see you do your YouTube shit and I ain't trying to be part of that type of shit. I just want to be part of. And then Az cut him off and said, well, if this is to go through, like none of that would even happen. None of that would even matter, boy. That would be irrelevant. It wouldn't even happen anymore. I just need to figure out, like, I'm just trying to figure out, how do you even know that this is something that Rob even wants anymore? That's all I'm trying to see, because that was in January. And then Arlen replied, he definitely won't, from what I4 told me and from what I'm hearing from another motherfucker, first name of I2, have you ever heard of? And then he mentioned somebody who is I3. So they're just talking about all these damn people in this conversation. And then whatever Azriel replied, they redacted that from this indictment. So she probably was incriminating herself. So then Arlen replied, no, I3, one of his homies, I3. So child, I'm thinking they probably got Keith and Will. And who else could be in on this conversation, child? Because we know we ain't heard from Will in a month of Sundays, okay? And then y'all know they say he done turned on Rob. So he is probably one of these individuals in this conversation. And then Don Russell probably one of the people in the conversation. And then Keith. So that's 3 people. So anyway, Azriel replied no. And then Arlen said, okay, I2 and I3 remember his homies. I4, the lawyer. Okay, so I4, who? Okay, which one of these lawyers? Okay, so we know I4 is a lawyer. I'm going to say with I2 is Keith, and then I'm going to go with I3 is Will. And then Az says, sounds very familiar, actually. And then Arlen replies, right. So basically with them, they're telling me that they claim you got some I don't know what the F you might got, some videos or some iPads or whatever you might got, your story. They just want that to disappear. You know what I'm saying? And then Az was like, yeah, Negro, I know what you saying. And then Arlen said, I don't really, like I said, I really don't know what you got, but they asked me to do something. I really don't got no contact with you. I hit you on IG. I hollered at I1 one time about it, and she ain't really say nothing. Okay, so I'm thinking that I1 is Cash, so we're gonna go with Cash as I1. I faded away from it, girl. And so then back to HSI. She says, based on my participation in this investigation, there is probable cause to believe that I4 is an attorney who has represented Kelly, but does not represent Kelly in United States versus Kelly. So I4, guys, is Brian Nix, I bet. Okay, and then we'll go with criminal docket. And y'all, this is just speculation. Y'all will be out there spreading these names that I'm giving y'all, because I don't know. I'm just, critical thinking here. So then it goes on to say, currently pending in the Eastern District of New York, a federal case currently pending in the Northern District of Illinois. A review of records of the Arlen 7687 telephone shows that Arlen Jr. called the number listed on I-4's website on 3 occasions: March 30th, 2020, May 8th, 2020, and May 18th, 2020. Based on my participation in the investigation, there is probable cause to believe that when Arlen Jr. said they claim you got some HIT, some videos or some iPads and your story, they just want that to disappear, he meant that I-2, I-3, and or I-4 told him that as had access to electronic evidence that could be used against Kelly, and that they wanted her to not tell her version of events regarding her relationship with him. There is further probable cause to believe that when Arlen Jr. said they asked me to do something, he meant that I-2 and I-3 asked Arlen Jr. to contact her, and that when Arlen Jr. said, I hit you on IG and I hollered at I-1 one time about it and she ain't really say nothing, I faded away from it. It was describing the steps he took to put into action the scheme to bribe Azriel. Specifically, Arlen Jr. referenced the time when he contacted her by sending a message to her Instagram account on January 9th, 2020, and explained that he had asked I-1 to get in contact with her, but when I-1 didn't, he did not take any further action until now. 14. Thereafter, at the direction of law enforcement, Azriel continued to communicate with Arlen Jr. over the Arlen 7687 telephone and with I-1 regarding payments by Arlen Jr. to Azriel at 1:01 a.m. on May 27, 2020. She sent a text message via iMessage to the Arlen 7687 telephone that read what her Cash App account is. Send them her Cash App. Y'all know folks be using them Cash Apps to get that money. I'm going to bed. Today has been long. Talk to you later, TTYL. Arlen Jr. responded by iMessage using the Arlen 7687 telephone. Okay, good night. On May 27, 2020 at 12:03 p.m., Arlen Jr. using the Arlen 7687 telephone sent a text message via iMessage to Azriel stating, "Good morning. Yeah. I-2 said Rob don't have that to give. Guess he's going to take his chances. If you ever need an opportunities, let me know." 16. Later that day, Azriel sent a text message via iMessage to I-1 that said, "I feel like he was," and then she used an emoji with long nose, basically lying, how he said Rob had all this money and then today nothing, and then she sent a second emoji. Initially at 6:10 p.m., 2 minutes after I-1 apparently read Azriel's earlier text message, I-1 said in part, "Like I said, you and I both know Rob was low on funds, and again, Rich hasn't spoke with Rob since January, so I don't know." It's kind of like read that like maybe she was like, "And helper, don't call me no more." Anyway, a little over 3 hours later at 9:32 p.m., I-1 wrote in part to Azriel, "So Rich just told me Rob would give $300,000. Azriel answered in 2 separate text messages via iMessage in part, "Did Rob speak to Rich? Because he literally just said, I-2 said he didn't have money to give and would take his chances," and then she inserted an emoji, "and that just doesn't make sense. Did one of them talk to Rob?" 17. On May 29, 2020 at 12:40 p.m., Arlen Jr. using the Arlen 7687 telephone sent a text message via iMessage to Azriel that read, "I'm in Florida. Significantly, Azriel resides in Florida. At the direction of law enforcement agents, Azriel thereafter called the Arlen 7687 telephone, which call was consensually recorded. During the call, Arlen Jr. told Azriel that he was in Miami. Their call was then cut off. 18. At 7:35 p.m., Arlen Jr., using the 7687 telephone, sent text messages via iMessage to Azriel that read, "I thought she or he told you I was coming out here. I would have bumped into you and holla at you. And yeah, also told her I was vacationing in Miami and we could have talked about everything. Based on my training experience and participation in the investigation, I believe that in these texts, Arlen Jr. was referring to his belief that I1 had told Azriel that he was traveling to Florida." And then they have in parentheses, "I thought she told you I was coming out here," in parentheses, and his interest in seeing Azriel in person, in parentheses, I would have bumped into you and holla at you, in parentheses. 19. On June 3rd, 2020, the Honorable P. Kevin Castell, United States District Judge for the Southern District of New York, authorized the interception of wire and electronic communications occurring to and from the 7687 telephone for a period of 30 days, hereinafter the Arlen wiretap. Monitoring of the Arlen 7687 telephone began on June 4th, 2020. The Arlen wiretap did not capture FaceTime calls over the Arlen 7687 telephone or iMessages sent or received by the Arlen 7687 telephone. 20. On June 10th, 2020 at 7:51 p.m. Eastern Time, Azriel, at the direction of law enforcement, sent a text message via iMessage to Arlen Jr. on the 7687 telephone, which read, "Hey, haven't heard from you in a minute. We still good?" Arlen Jr. answered, "Yeah, we good. How you doing?" And Azriel responded, "Haven't heard from you, so I don't know where we stand." These iMessages were not intercepted over the wire, but Azriel provided copies of those messages to law enforcement. 21. On June 10, 2020 at 8:08 p.m. Eastern Time, Arlen Jr. called, Lord Jesus, I5, an individual who has posted a series of interviews on YouTube channel that were favorable to Kelly, including, among others, an interview of I2. Okay, so we know I5 is probably Don Russell. So who is I2? Yeah, I2 did an interview too. At the beginning of the call, after Arlen Jr. said, "I ain't heard from you in a minute," I5 responded, so we already know this Don, responded, "Oh man, yeah, you know, I had done talked to and then he's talking about I3. He said he gonna hit you up, and I know you is been in contact with," and then we're gonna say Brian. Arlen Jr. then said, how would you feel if I told you I might be able to get you Azriel?" A minute later, Arlen Jr. received an incoming telephone call from Azriel, described in the following paragraph, and told Don that he would call him later. Don said, "All right, call me right back. 22. At 8:09 p.m. Eastern Time, at the direction of law enforcement, Azriel called Arlen Jr. on the Arlen 7687 telephone. At the beginning of the call, apparently in reference to Azriel's iMessage, Arlen Jr. said, "Now, what you mean by what? How we stand? Because last time I heard from anybody was I1, and our child think I1 is cash, and she was like, what's the most you think he would give me, whatever." Like then I was like, maybe 300 $300, and she said she was gonna holler at you, and I never heard nothing else from either one of you all, so I really don't know what's going on. Yeah, she just asking like, what's the most he probably would give her? And I told her that he said what she would, what they say. What ghetto foolishness is that? And she said she was going to get back with you. So ain't nobody ever get with me. Maybe the price was so low. She said might purchase a house. And then it's got PH. And then and then I guess it's unaudible. And I definitely told her that he got about like $300 to give. Azriel explained that I1 had not relayed anything to her. She then said, so have you talked to I2 or anybody? And Arlen Jr. answered, yeah, I was just on the phone with him like about 8 this morning. Then they had the following exchange. Azriel, okay, well the 300 is okay, so I just need to know how we going to like go about it. And then Arlen Jr. replied, oh, okay, yeah, I'm calling him. And I tell him that, you know, she said that's cool. Like I said, that was like shit, near 2 weeks ago when I1 hit me, and she was like, what's the most? And I told her that shit, you know, I don't know why she ain't get back with me. Like, that's what I asked her to do 2 weeks ago. But Azriel was like, but what did I2 say? That's who got the money. Why is we going through all these other people? And then Azriel was like, but what did... Sorry, I just read that part. And then Arlen replied, okay, I talked to I2. I talked to I2 from day about some different things. Lord Jesus. At the end of the telephone conversation, Azriel asked Arlen Jr. for a 3-way telephone call between her, Arlen Jr., and I2. Arlen Jr. answered, I'll set it up, boo. 23. After Arlen Jr. concluded the phone conversation with Azriel at 8:17 p.m., Arlen Jr. called, who did I say was, Dawn. When Dawn asked, what's she trying to do? Arlen Jr. answered, she trying to get money. Dawn answered, I know how to do that. Arlen Jr. then said, her ass, man, she thinking Rob gonna pay her to be quiet. Like, man, that shit ain't finna happen. Trying to get I2 on the phone, see what he wanna do. Cause in a minute, I'ma tell her ass, man, F it. Cause I might holler at I4, and I4 was like, nah, he ain't trying to pay nobody else but the old Rob. The Rob I know, like, first I4 don't speak lawyer. Lord Jesus, what was that sentence? I know, like, I'm gonna say Brian don't speak. And then he says something lawyer. And then Rob, if I had talked to Rob on the phone and Rob got the money, he gonna pay Azriel to be quiet. Like, if I had a way to talk to Rob, being next to him and telling him what's going on without nobody listening to, no feds, nobody, he gonna pay her ass off to be quiet. She got too much, man. So during the conversation, Don mentioned that Azriel might be in cahoots with the FBI and questioned whether a financial settlement with Azriel for her silence would even help Kelly at this point, explaining that several of the victims named in the indictments against Kelly had previously received settlements from Kelly, and suggesting that Azriel could not damage Kelly too much. After Arlen Jr. and Don ended their telephone call, Arlen Jr. sent a text message via iMessage to Azriel that read, he got a new spokesman, said Rob not willing to pay you about was instructed to help you make money in a major way. Based on my participation in this investigation, there's a probable cause to believe that he, referring to Kelly, like the prior messages, this iMessage was not intercepted on the Arlen wiretap, but was provided to law enforcement by Azriel. Now, I want you guys to notice that when it comes down to the important messaging, it's never caught on the wiretap. They then get text messages, copies of text messages from Azriel, which means that these text messages could be doctored, like we don't know where they came from. And so it goes on to say at 9:12 p.m. Eastern, Azriel, again at the direction of law enforcement, called Arlen Jr. and told him she was confused. Arlen Jr. responded and stated, yeah, so ish, all I know is I just seen some ish that like just blew my mind. So ish, I just called I too. Like I told you, I ain't really been talking to him about y'all since we talked, which was about 2 weeks ago. So I just called him right now. He like, man, holla at Don. I'm like, why I need to holla at Don for? He like, man, Don doing everything from now on. He's speaking for Rob. He talking to Rob. And I'm like, I'm thinking he bullshit. And he like, man, go check out the video. So I go check out the video. And he on the video having a live interview with Don. And like basically Rob is talking to this dude named Don now. Okay, now I need to go find this video, okay? Because I might have these names all wrong, okay? Because I remember Don doing several interviews, but I don't remember him doing an interview with the person I think is I2, but I think that I2 did an interview, but I don't remember Don being there. Okay, hell, maybe I5 is Dr. Rice. We don't know. Okay, like, scratch that. I ain't trying to implicate Dr. Rice in nothing. Just trying to guess on these names, make it make sense. Hell, maybe it's Dana J. Did Dana J say he was the publicist at one point? Okay, child, that's a mess. Anyway, during the conversation, Azriel asked, so whose idea was it to pay this $300,000? And Arlen Jr. said, no. So when I1 called me, she said, what's the most? I said, hold on. I told I2, and I2 like, shit, I'll probably do somewhere in the 300, looking at how much money this nigga got. So I went back and told I1 300. That was 2 weeks. And then there was an audio glitch. And then he says, and she never responded to me when Azriel asked, and now Don is, and so that means Don just came in play about 2 weeks ago. And then Arlen answered, man, probably about a week ago or so, where he been putting this ish in place, where he doing all the talking for him and ish, because he told me, because I talked to I4 as well, and I tried to holler at I4 about this, the money situation too, and he was like, no, we ain't doing that. And I was like, why? And he said that I5, which is Dawn, I think, named too. Oh Lord, she is like, she be on some old other ish though. So that's like when I first talked to Lord Jesus, girl, they got him, her. I hollered at him, her, and first name of I2 to see where they was at with the ish, and that's when we all started talking. But she knocked it down right away. But first, I2 was like, yeah, you probably could try to work it out. So based on my participation in the investigation, there is probable cause to believe that in the 2 weeks between when Arlen Jr. first communicated with Azriel and suggested that Kelly would pay $300,000 for her silence and the time of this June 10th, 2020 telephone call, the situation may have changed, including by putting Don as opposed to I2 in charge of the strategy for Kelly, and that Don may be less inclined to participate in the direct payoff of Azriel. 25 at 9:27 p.m., Arlen Jr. called Don and told Don that Azriel wanted to have a three-way call with Arlen Jr. and Don agreed. The three-way call finally took place at 9:45 p.m. During that telephone conversation, Arlen Jr. clarified in substance that after Azriel initially requested a $2 million settlement, Arlen Jr. contacted I-2 and I-3, referring to each other by their first names, and they said in substance that Kelly could not afford a $2 million settlement. Arlen Jr. explained that the $300,000 settlement came about when I-1 called him and asked how much, and that I-3 then called I-2, who suggested $300,000. Don then told Azriel that Don would contact I-2 to find out exactly what I-2 meant, and mentioned that I-3 had called I-5. What did I say was I-3? Was I saying that was what the boy name that disappeared? Will. I don't think I-3 is Will, because it seemed like Will disappeared off the scene quite some time ago. We haven't heard him mention his best friend or anything, so I-3 might not be Will. So we're gonna have to figure out who I-3 is. But anyway, called Don 2 weeks ago and told Don about the situation. Following that telephone call, Arlen Jr. said Don spoke again at 10:11 p.m. Oh, y'all, baby, that would be interesting. Oh, yeah. Let me find out that the flower lady is involved in all of this. I'm going to have to go back and look through this, because, they started with that him, her, letting us know that it probably was a woman that they were referring to. So anyway, and the reason I keep saying Cash is one of these people, because supposedly this Arlen guy is related to the publicist. And wasn't Cash calling herself a publicist at one time? But anyway, following that telephone call, Arlen and Don spoke again at 10:11 p.m. and Don suggested that Azriel was a loose cannon. Well, hell, he should have known that from Jump Street before any of these phone calls started. So 26, on Friday, June 11, 2020, Arlen Jr. traveled from Chicago to Houston, Texas. To celebrate his wife's birthday. During the trip on June 12, 2020 at 11:36 p.m. at the direction of law enforcement, Azriel called Arlen Jr. and told him, "Let's just go with the settlement. I don't know if Don got back to you." Arlen Jr. ended the telephone call by telling Azriel, "Let me see what's going on. I'll have an answer in the morning about the money." Child, Arlen, you should have known this was some nonsense. On June 14, 2020, Arlen Jr. called I-3, but the telephone call went to voicemail. I-3 twice tried to return Arlen Jr.'s call, but Arlen Jr. did not pick up the calls, because I think he was getting smart at that point. 27, on June 15, 2020 at 10:45 a.m., Arlen Jr. and I-3 finally connected. During the call, I-3 said, "I talked to Don. He said you would hit him up." And Arlen Jr. said, "Oh yeah, I talked to him a little bit." Arlen Jr. explained that Azriel wanted money to be quiet. Arlen Jr. explained that Don said it would be futile to pay her because Azriel probably would not end up cooperating with law enforcement. At the end of the call, Arlen Jr., who was still in Houston, said that he would hit I-3 when he got back around, i.e. when he returned to Chicago. Now, I thought they said I-5 was in Houston. Let's go back up here. Okay. Azriel called Arlen Jr. and told him, "Let's go with the settlement." And then Arlen said, "I don't know." So who was in Houston? Okay, let me go back up here. Okay, on Friday, Arlen traveled from Chicago to Houston, for his wife's birthday. Child, y'all got wives and out here cutting up, acting the fool like this. It's just too much. Okay, so let's see. Okay, 28. To date, Azriel has not received any money from the defendant, Richard Arline Jr., and it remains unclear whether Kelly, I-2, I-3, and I-4 implicitly or explicitly authorized Arlen Jr. to negotiate a bribe payment on behalf of Kelly. As described above, there is probable cause to believe that Arlen Jr. in fact sought to coordinate a bribe payment to Azriel in exchange for her agreement to cease her cooperation with federal law enforcement regarding the case against Kelly pending in the Eastern District of New York. 29. Because public filing of this document could result in a risk of flight by the defendant, as well as jeopardize the government's investigation, your deponent respectfully requests that the complaint and arrest warrant be filed under seal. And then she signs off on it, and here we are. And then, as I stated in the last two indictments that I read, these cases were sealed up until today when they were unsealed and the arrests were made. I believe that Don is not in custody, but I could be wrong, and I'm not sure about the Arlen, Richard Arlen or Mike Williams. One of them had their arraignment yesterday and the other one had their arraignment this morning. But the articles that I read did not state whether or not they were given a bond or whether they were held over for trial, if they're going to be transported to New York, because one's in Chicago, one was in Valdosta, Georgia. So a lot going on, but this is, what it is. And let's see, arrest warrant. You are commanded to arrest and bring before a United States magistrate judge without unnecessary delay Richard Arlen Jr., who is accused of an offense or violation based on the following document filed with the court. And that was just the arrest information. So guys, y'all saw me on here or heard me on here, trying to figure out who these people are. So let's just play a game in the comments. And who do y'all think I-1, I-2, I-3, I-4, and I-5 is? I believe I-4 is Brian Nix because he picked up the Heather Williams civil suit back in March, and then these dates are coordinated, and then we know that I-5 is probably Don because Don has been all over YouTube doing interviews pretending like he represents Robert. And so I-1 we're thinking is Cash. Is that her name, Cash Jones? Because didn't she say she was the publicist at one point? And we know that she too has been around these YouTube streets doing interviews as well. So those are my thoughts on who these people are. And then I'm thinking that Keith is I-2 because remember he did the interview also online. And then I-3, I guess, basically could be anybody. So go ahead, leave your comments below, rate the video, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And until the next time, I shall talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.